Trump say
Welcome back.
that he wasn't asleep? He was just closing his beautiful blue eyes.
Yep.
And taking everything in.
Yeah. Okay. Take it all in. Day 12 of Donald Trump's hush money criminal trial resumes this morning in a New York City courtroom after a revealing day of testimony on Friday when Trump's former confidant and longtime aide, Hope Hicks, took the witness stand. Hicks testified about what it was like inside Trump's 2016 presidential campaign and how the alleged hush money payments came about. Let's bring in former litigator and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Lisa, everyone was talking about sort of the emotional part of this where Hope broke down. But what is it that she brought to the table in terms of what the prosecution is looking to prove?
I think, Mika, that Hope was the most valuable witness on the context of what was happening in the campaign in October 2016 that would have led Michael Cohen and Donald Trump to believe that a payoff to Stormy Daniels was not just advisable, but absolutely necessary to preserve his chances. I had a chance to reread the testimony over the weekend once we had the transcript, and the timeline that she puts into motion is absolutely devastating. It starts with being notified of the Access Hollywood tape by the Washington Post. She's the first person that the campaign, in the campaign, to understand that the Washington Post has the tape and the transcript on October 7th. Once the tape is released and the article is published, so many things happen in rapid succession. A number of very prominent Republicans quickly disassociate themselves from Donald Trump and the campaign. You've got another tape and a rumor about it coming to her the next day on October 8th. Then by October 9th, Trump has his next debate. The first question out of the gate, or one of them from Anderson Cooper and Martha Raddatz, is about the Access Hollywood tape. By October 10th, the New York Times is publishing reports of other problematic behavior that Trump has had with women. And then by the 15th and the 16th, Trump is again on the offensive, pushing back against these other women's stories, not stories involving Stormy Daniels or Karen McDougal, but other women who have accused Trump of misconduct in this period. And so she is taking us through in rapid fire succession, one crisis after another, precipitated all at once by the Access Hollywood tape, from which they can't get out from under. It's no wonder, after seeing Hope Hicks's testimony, that Michael Cohen, Dylan Howard, David Pecker, Donald Trump are engineering these settlement payments to happen because they needed this problem to go away, as opposed to continuing throughout November and up till Election Day, Mika.
So Politico says in their story reporting on this that Hope Hicks offered the defense their first glimmer of hope here, and says that Trump's lawyers have argued that Trump's motivation in seeking to silence two women, former Playboy model Karen McDougal and porn star Stormy Daniels, as prosecutors relate, but instead to protect his family. The motive is important because in trying to convict Trump of 34 felonies, prosecutors are seeking to link allegedly fraudulent business records with violations of election laws. There were parts of her testimony where she actually did say he was doing it to protect the family, right?
Well, yes and no. I would say, Joe, she said it was a motivation, but not the motivation or even the principal motivation. It's like having two hungry mouths to feed, and if the defense is one of those mouths, she gave them a nice and tasty dessert, but she saved the main meal for the prosecution, in that she revealed in 2018, once Michael Cohen came forward and told the New York Times that he had made the payment to Stormy Daniels, Hope Hicks, at the very end of her testimony, describes a conversation that she had with Donald Trump very shortly thereafter, where he told her that he had spoken to Cohen and that Cohen had made that payment out of the goodness of his heart to protect Trump from false accusations. Hope didn't believe that, but what she said next was the more devastating thing. Trump then said to her, I think it was better that this come out now than if it had come out during the campaign and Michael hadn't made that payment at all. It was clear to her that the primary motivation, and while she didn't say this outright, she was conveying for Donald Trump the most important motivating factor was not Melania's feelings, but preserving his electoral chances.
So, Lisa, let's look ahead to this week. What do we know about who we might hear from? And also, is there more gag order details to get through? I believe there was going to be a second hearing for some gag order rules broken.
Let's start with the second part. There was that second hearing. I do not believe that the punishment for the alleged violations will be incarceration, in part, Mika, because they happened before the first hearing. And so if incarceration could be a penalty for his criminal contempt, this wouldn't have done it. In terms of what to expect this week, I think it's really anybody's guess. But I can tell you thematically, it feels like Hope Hicks is the last witness, at least for right now, to testify to the formation of the conspiracy to get Donald Trump elected by paying off these women, and that we should be moving into the real heart of the matter here, which is the falsification of business records in order to conceal that conspiracy to elect Donald Trump through unlawful means. So who are we likely to see here in this phase? A number of Trump Organization employees who are involved in the invoices and general ledger statements. We also might hear from Madeleine Westerhout, who was Trump's executive assistant in the White House. You might be asking yourself, what does she have to do with all of this? Well, she's the person at the White House who had to place the 9 checks that Donald Trump signed in front of him. And we've already seen through Rona Graff's testimony one email in particular where Rona and she are discussing, like, how do we send these things back and forth? Can you send me a FedEx label? I'm sending you checks for him to sign. So count on Madeleine Westerhout being a critical witness here to establishing that Donald Trump had knowledge and participation in this portion of the crime, which, as I said, is really the heart of what the Manhattan DA's office has to prove.
MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, thank you so much. John Meacham, there is simply, we won't even ask, and we stopped asking some time ago for historical parallels.
They're just simply
there are no historical parallels in this country, but my gosh, as you said before, what is at stake is so massive this fall. I'm curious your thoughts when you see this testimony and then the Time Magazine article, the continued threats of an authoritarian regime coming directly from Donald Trump. It's so interesting. People say, oh, they've got Trump derangement syndrome if they say, and then they will repeat something that Donald Trump has said directly himself and project it onto other people. You know, Donald Trump constantly saying something and then I'm going to terminate the Constitution. I never said I was going to terminate the Constitution. I'm going to be a dictator. I'm going
to monitor women's pregnancies.
I'm going to monitor I'm in support of monitoring women's pregnancies. Then they'll say, I never said that. But of course, giving his people what they want to hear. So I'm just curious about your take of where we are right now.
I think my answer is at once, to me, thrilling and terrifying. It's thrilling because it's up to all of us. It's up to the voters in the 7 or 8 states. It's up to those of us who have strong feelings about the continuance of the constitutional order to make this case. And that's great, right? That's we the people. What's terrifying is that it's up to us. And it's up to the voters in the swing states, and it's up to those of us who have to make the case to people around the country. If there's no mystery here, right, I think it's going to be impossible for people to vote in the fall and not understand what's at stake. And then maybe that's part of what those of us who, want to make this case have to keep doing, is making sure we say it. And it may seem repetitive to the political industrial class, but that doesn't matter. I think as Ed was saying, that there are normal people who are better adjusted than we are and don't worry about this all the time. But it's really, really important. And I don't think there's, again, what I would say...
Gosh, it keeps on going, and she keeps doubling down.
Yeah, it's like clean up on aisle 4, and then they come
down
and
aisle 5.
knock everything down. Yeah, it's
another possible running mate for Donald Trump making headlines this morning. We're going to show you what Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina had to say about accepting the results of this year's election.
More importantly, and more to the point, to show you where the Republican Party is in 2024, what he said about not, or what he didn't say, actually, about accepting the will of the people.
It's just disturbing, and I guess we should expect it at this point, but I will continue to be shocked.
It's a sign of Trump's Republican Party, where the autocratic bent they've taken him. We'll show you that in a little bit.
Also, we'll get you caught up on Donald Trump's hush money trial, the criminal trial, which resumes later this morning in New York City. It comes after emotional testimony on Friday from the former president's longtime aide, Hope Hicks. Plus, we'll have a live report from Jerusalem on the new developments in the ceasefire negotiation between Israel and Hamas. A lot going on. Good morning on this Monday morning, May 6th. Welcome to Morning Joe. With us, we have the host of Way Too Early, White House Bureau Chief at Politico, Jonathan Lemire. U.S. National Editor at the Financial Times, Ed Luce, is with us. Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University, historian John Meacham.
We met
is
by the
with
way.
us.
We're going to get into this in a
We
second.
understand that Meacham was a difficult student.
That's what we were told yesterday by someone who taught him Shakespeare at the University of the South.
And it was a head-shaking response to how difficult. Yes,
difficult. Well, I think she may have just been saying,
difficult.
You already knew everything.
Oh,
and so exactly.
Oh, or sure. Yeah, that's probably what it was. Yeah.
Or thought you knew everything.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That is definitely true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also with us this morning, columnist and associate editor for the Washington Post, David Ignatius, is with us. He's the author of the new thriller, which is out tomorrow.
Oh my gosh.
Entitled Phantom Orbit, and we can't wait to talk about that.
Telling you, these are so exciting, David. And when the amazing thing about your books is, and the few people who try to do this but can't quite do it as well as you do, is there are often things that you can write in these books that you can't write in nonfiction books.
Right.
It's an accumulation of a lot of things that you've learned through the years that you just can't write because it's been, off the record. It's been deep background. You've been, as Meacham, places you shouldn't have gone, and you learn things that other people haven't learned. But you put it all together in these extraordinary books.
So, Joe, I have a friend from Syria who said to me once, David, you tell the truth more in your fiction than in your journalism. I don't know how to respond to that, but there is a kind of truth in this book about what's coming at us, which is space warfare. That's the future of warfare. We're seeing it. Ukraine is the first space war. So those are the kinds of things I'm trying to deal with in this new novel.
Wonderful. We'll talk more about it. David, thanks for being on this morning.
And you talked about rip from the headlines. I was reading an article yesterday specifically about the fear of Putin's war in space and what countries across the world are trying to do to catch up with it.
Let's get to our top story this morning. Two new polls find President Joe Biden narrowly leading Donald Trump in November's general election race. In the first, from ABC News and Ipsos, Biden is up 4 points, 49 to 45% among likely voters nationwide. In the second, from NPR, PBS, and Marist College, Biden holds a 5-point lead, 52 to 47% among registered voters who say they definitely plan to vote in November. That is still within the margin of error. What do you make at this point? It's kind of hard to take any poll that seriously, but what is it telling you in terms of the state of the race?
Yep.
And also the fact that it's tight, given the options.
Well, we're so many months out, so these polls in May just don't make a huge difference. But I will tell you, as a candidate myself, when I was a candidate myself, I would take a poll from time to time. You just want to see, you want to test the temperature. You want to, and again, as I've always said, you want to look at trends. We saw a couple months ago Joe Biden far behind in a lot of polls. these show something quite different, that he's now moving ahead of Donald Trump again among likely voters. Polls of adults, even polls of registered voters, this far out. You might as well be watching Housewives of Beverly Hills, which I hear is really heated up quickly this season. But something as you dig into these polls, I think makes this election actually unique, at least in America. But I think it's the way we're going. Ed Luce, I want to go to you really quickly. The Financial Times, I think a couple months ago, talked about how the approval ratings of candidates, presidential candidates, incumbents, just collapsed. And so if you're trying to predict how an election's going to turn out, don't look at that, because you'll have as much luck as they did in France when they were seeing Macron in the low 30s and then ending up winning, 50, he got 57, 58% of the vote. We see that here, especially in the ABC poll, where Joe Biden's approval ratings are as low as they've been. And on issues, Donald Trump doing better than the president in many areas. But then you start asking about who has better character, who's a better person, who understands people like you, and those sort of questions. And Joe Biden wins. In some of those, he wins by a great deal. And so those approval ratings, again, just as the Financial Times had reported several months ago, low approval ratings, and yet he still prevails, especially against a candidate like Donald Trump. Is that just where we are now because of social media and everything else? You're just going to have presidential incumbents with low approval ratings that may end up like Macron winning comfortably.
Yeah, I think that's well put, Joe. I mean, the governments all around the democratic world have low approval ratings. Relative to most of the rest of the West, other democracies, America is the fastest growing economy, is doing far better, in fact, than countries across the Atlantic. And yet Biden's ratings are as low as they are there. So there is a general just anti-incumbency feeling across the democratic world. A good economy doesn't seem to make that much difference. But we're not really at the choice stage where most voters are focusing like we do obsessionally here in the Beltway. And I think, therefore, once we do get those polls, I've always had, after Labor Day, I've always had the hunch that this is going to be a referendum on Trump, not on Biden.
Right.
Because Trump will make it a referendum on Trump. He just can't help himself. So you might think I'm being a bit Panglossian, but I think ultimately Biden's got the edge here. I hope I'm not going to live to regret those words.
Right. Well, while you were talking, I actually wrote a note to Mika. I said, I fear Ed is being a bit Panglossian.
I know.
And I think
it's a good word
I
for
my thought
Monday
as well.
morning.
It's so weird. We almost said the same thing to each other.
We did. It's really strange. We're kind of
It's like we finish each other's sentences.
But a great point, though. John, it does. It's beautiful. And John Meacham, I think Ed is so right. 2016, we look back, that was not about Donald Trump, actually. That was about Hillary Clinton. It was a referendum on the Clintons, on the Bushes, on the people who had run the country since 1980. And then 2020, obviously a referendum on Donald Trump. And I just, with all that he's saying, the fact that he has to say something shocking and new every day just to sort of amp up his base, 2024 will also be, at the end of the day, a referendum on Donald Trump.
Well, that makes it a referendum on the battle for our better angels, which is not Panglossian. I think that's a discernible truth. And these darker instincts, these authoritarian instincts that the former president is articulating. He's saying it all. So for those of us who believe that this is about democracy, democratic norms, a constitution that, for all of its imperfections, continues to enable us to try to create a more perfect union, all of which shouldn't necessarily be on the ballot, right? I mean, we're voting on a role of the state in the marketplace. We're voting perhaps on the role of how we project force in the world. Those are the ordinary political choices. This is not that. This is about, do you believe in a we the people, or do you believe in I am your retribution? And so, yes, it's a referendum on Trump, but presidential politics, well, not but, and presidential politics is a choice. It's a binary choice. Although, and I'll ask, I don't know if this polling shows this, how the third-party candidates are doing is going to matter enormously. And so, I believe 49-45. That makes some sense to me. But when you introduce the other possibilities here, who does that hurt is a really important question. And as you said, really in about 7 or 8 states.
Yeah, and in this poll, at least in the ABC poll, even with all the other candidates introduced, Joe Biden still beats Donald Trump. It is, though, still in the range of the margin of error. Jonathan Lemire, I just wanted to follow up on what Ed Lieu said offhandedly about the American economy being superior to all other economies across the globe. It's not even close. As the Wall Street Journal said, the United States is the envy of the world at the end of the year. One of its, the editor emeritus of the opinion page said the great winner of 2023 was the American economy. The loser, China's economy. You look at all the numbers, and we can pick through the numbers, say, oh, it's a little too... We've been complaining for the past year that the economy is too strong, that it's too hot, that it's pushing up inflation because it's so strong. But, people across the world are looking at our economy and post-COVID and wondering how in the world we did it because it is so superior to other economies, both our friends and our enemies.
No question, America's post-pandemic economy, the envy of the world. Some signs made at the end of last week that perhaps some of that heat was cooling off, which might allow the Fed to tweak interest rates. Unclear, though, whether that will happen between now and the November election. And let's be clear here, national polls only mean so much, though, Joe, I agree. The trend lines have been pro-Biden in recent weeks, except for that one outlier from CNN, maybe about a week back, which had Trump up 5 or 6. Most seem to be going Biden's direction now. But as we well know, this is not a campaign that's going to be run in a national election. It's about the battleground states. Those swing states polls, very close. Trump up in more than Biden, but virtually every state within the margin of error. We heard over the weekend from some Republicans who think that Minnesota and Virginia could be in play. Consider me highly doubtful of that, particularly Virginia. Trump was close in Minnesota before, though. Well, we should know he actually came close in Minnesota previously. But David Ignatius, we know the Biden team, there's a couple pickups they're looking at, too. North Carolina, first and foremost. They feel good about where they are there. Florida, more of a reach. But at the very least, they think they'll force the Republicans to spend some resources. I know you had a conversation with some senior Biden folks over the weekend. Give us their insights as to where they think the race stands.
So, John, the interesting thing about my conversations with these Biden campaign officials is that their own polling shows that a lot of people who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 aren't convinced yet that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee. And once they become convinced of it, it happens. He is the candidate. There's more of a chance of what we've all been talking about, which is that this election is not a referendum on Joe Biden with all of his weaknesses and gaffes. It's a referendum on the person who was president for 4 years, Donald Trump. And you remind people systematically what that was like. You bring back all the memories that people have. Let's not forget that in 2022, when the Republicans thought they'd have a red wave, they didn't. Why? Because people look back at the Trump years with a lot of distaste. So I think that's basically their idea. One interesting thing, Jonathan, is that we think that with Trump tied down in court in New York, scowling at everybody, looking like he's miserable, that's probably good for the campaign for Biden. But actually, the Biden people, I think, would rather have him out in the country saying things that then get him in trouble. The Time magazine interview is a perfect example. But they feel like every time he's out there on the loose, he says something that reminds people this is how he would govern. And they think that's really the best thing they've got going.
Well, and
I think he's done that in his Time magazine interview.
But David's so right.
Nothing like seeing it.
And the campaign's so right. The people that are the professionals, actually, Donald Trump has professionals running his campaign. And for them, less is more. The less Donald Trump's out on the campaign trail, the less he's saying crazy things, the more they can say, "Oh, look back and look back at how great things were in 2019, 2018." That's what they want to do, and pretend that this explosive volcanic side of Donald Trump doesn't exist. So it is so interesting when you hear people saying, "Oh, this is Biden that wants him in court." No, Joe Biden and the campaign team would love him at rallies every night, again, because he says just crazy things. He loses his train of thought. Sometimes he looks like a doddering old man, they say. And we could show the clips, but in court, all he has to do, he can sleep. He can do whatever he's doing.
Salacious, hideous things are being, proposed about his activity. I mean,
right.
I don't know. I think it's a balance. We'll see how it. I've heard this many times that they'd rather have him out there. I'm not sure.
But then he walks out and he has, he'll
his
talk.
Little moment.
He'll talk for 30 seconds, and they can contain that. That's very easy to contain, and then he can just play victim the rest of the time. So.
Well, we'll watch and see what happens, and court resumes today. So a lot to talk about moving forward in the next few hours with that in terms of Donald Trump's criminal trial in New York City. Let's move, though, to the fast-moving developments out of the Middle East now. NBC News and the Associated Press reports CIA Director Bill Burns may now have to travel to Israel to hold more talks about a potential ceasefire in an effort to free hostages from the Gaza Strip. Over the weekend, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel was not prepared to end the war permanently, saying such a move would leave Hamas in power. Meanwhile, an Israeli Defense Forces spokesman said around 100,000 Palestinian civilians have been told to evacuate the city of Rafa as Israel appears poised to launch a new operation there. A senior Arab negotiator directly involved in the talks with Israel and the United States tells NBC News that the ceasefire negotiations are not over and have not collapsed. It is not yet clear when or whether a major Rafa operation could begin. Adding further complication to the ceasefire talks is an attack that happened yesterday near a southern border crossing into Gaza, which killed 4 Israeli soldiers and injured at least 10 others, according to the IDF. Hamas took responsibility for the assault that Israeli military officials say involved roughly 14 rockets and mortars. The IDF, in turn, destroyed the weapon involved in carrying out the attack, as well as other Hamas military infrastructure. There's no indication whether the crossing itself was the target of the attack. Joining us now from Jerusalem is NBC News Chief Foreign Correspondent Richard Engle. Richard, what more can you tell us this morning?
So it seems we are at a crossroads right now. There had been some progress over the last several days to try and reach a ceasefire. Those ceasefire talks fell apart over the weekend, and now there is an effort to try and cobble them back together. But there are real differences between Hamas's position and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's position and his government's position. So we either have a deal, and there's definitely an effort to try and reach a deal, or the deal is blown up and Israeli forces go into Rafa. And both seem likely, and pressure is being put on both of these fronts right now. So let me start with, and they're absolutely interrelated. So let me start on the ceasefire front, and then the pressure that's being put on Rafa, and you mentioned those evacuation orders. First, on the ceasefire, there was an attempt to reach in a ceasefire. There were Hamas negotiators, Qatari negotiators, Egyptian negotiators, all meeting in various locations, Cairo primarily, and Hamas said it wants to make a deal. It's ready to make a deal. It received a document from Israel. It said it was studying it positively. Israel didn't send a negotiator to that forum, and the talks fell apart. They fell apart because the two sides don't agree on what the deal is ultimately going to achieve. What Hamas says it wants is an end to this round of fighting, an end to this current conflict, not an end globally to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but an end to the Gaza fighting. And it wants Israeli troops to pull back. That would leave, effectively, Hamas, some sort of Hamas government in charge, and in exchange for that, for Israel agreeing to end the conflict and pulling out, there would be hostage releases. The Israeli government says it will not accept that. It would only give a temporary ceasefire, days, weeks, in order to get some hostages out, and then would continue to go after Hamas. And Palestinians, including Hamas representatives, say that doesn't make any sense. What incentive does Hamas have to release the only leverage that it's holding, these hostages, about 100 of them still believed to be alive, if Israel says, once you do release them, then we're just going to go after you and try and eliminate you. The other focus here is the city of Rafa. That's where about 1 million Palestinians are taking shelter. It's right in the southern part of the country. There was an attack in that area yesterday carried out by Hamas that you just mentioned. That is also where it is believed the Hamas leadership is holding out, is the last place still under Hamas effective control. Now, the Palestinians who are there don't want to see the Israelis move in a major way. President Biden has said that he doesn't want to see the Israeli military move in a major way. It would be a humanitarian catastrophe. But Israel says the only way to eliminate Hamas, take it from power in Gaza, is by going into Rafa. And today we saw the first concrete action signaling that Israel might in fact do that, dropping leaflets, sending text messages to about 100,000 people in a corner of Rafa, telling them to leave because a major military action is coming. The major military action in Rafa hasn't started yet. It could be a warning. It could be a part of a negotiating tactic because, like I said earlier, these things are both related. It could be that the Israelis are just trying to put pressure on Hamas, saying, not only are we prepared to come into Rafah, we're going to do it. We're already issuing leaflets for people to leave, so you better agree to the terms right now. Things are at a critical juncture, I think, right now, and we will see if we either have a major invasion into Rafah or some sort of deal perhaps emerging in the next several days.
All right, NBC's Richard Engle, live in Jerusalem. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your report. David Ignatius, so the question is how to get to this. Us is demanding an evacuation of the IDF from Gaza, and that'll never happen. I mean, Israel, the Israeli people, this is not about Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israeli people simply will never, ever, ever stand for Hamas running Gaza again. And I'm not so sure many Palestinian people in Gaza would like that as well. So how do you split that difference? How do you get the hostages home? And how do you make the ceasefire long enough to get buy-in from Hamas so these families can be reunited with their hostages and humanitarian aid can go in unabated in Gaza?
So, Joe, this is why we're at an impasse. And the way I would sum it up is that Hamas is still playing for a win. Hamas wants to come out of this so it can proclaim that it was victorious in the campaign that began October 7. And Israel, understandably, is determined to resist that. So we're at this moment where there is, I think, growing consensus in Israel that they have to do this last Rafa operation. I was struck by the fact that the Chief of Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, who's been the person the U.S. government has felt most comfortable talking with in these last weeks, came out yesterday in favor of the invasion of Rafa in a more forthright way than he has. I found the fact that they were actually leafleting parts of Rafa saying, "Flee for your lives, the IDF is coming," important. I can remember being in Beirut in 1982 when those leaflets came down from the sky saying the same thing, and they mean it. So we do have 11th hour efforts by Bill Burns to put some compromise on the table that allows each side to feel that it can say it's winning when it's in fact a compromise. Bill Burns is an artist. If anybody can do it, Burns can. But at this point, I think the likelihood that these combatants, as exhausted as they are, and as battered as the Palestinian civilian population of Gaza is, even so, I have a terrible feeling that this war is going to go on further because the combatants are not exhausted. One thing the United States could do is to say, we feel it's time for this war to end. If Israel